Hello, and welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep these late night stories alive, and I'd love to hear which moments stay with you after the lights go out. Now, let's step into the middle of a winter storm, one that turned Denver International Airport into a place no one could leave, no matter how badly they wanted to. It was the evening of December 15th, 2022, when the first wave of heavy snow began to sweep across Colorado's Front Range. Inside Denver International Airport, thousands of travelers were already gathering for evening departures. The weather outside was relentless. Thick curtains of snow falling faster than the plows could clear, wind pressing against the glass walls, and announcements echoing across the terminals. Among those stranded was Emily Carter, a 31-year-old teacher from Birmingham, England, who had planned to catch a connecting flight to New York before heading home for the holidays. She had been in the United States for 2 weeks, visiting old friends in California, and Denver was supposed to be just a quick stopover. Instead, she found herself watching the departure board filled with a sea of red letters. Canceled. 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 It wasn't just Emily at gate C-37. Families huddled together on the floor with children wrapped in coats. College students leaned against their backpacks trying to find an outlet for their dying phones. And business travelers paced while calling offices to explain they wouldn't make it to their meetings. The airport, usually buzzing with the rhythm of arrivals and departures, now felt more like a temporary shelter, an enclosed world where time slowed, and everyone was waiting for news that might never come. Emily tightened her scarf and looked around, trying to read the mood. The loudspeaker crackled once more. Ladies and gentlemen, due to worsening weather conditions, all outgoing flights are grounded until further notice. Please stay inside the terminal. We appreciate your patience. Groans filled the air, and a young boy began to cry softly near the row of vending machines. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of easing. At around 9 p.m., Emily found herself sitting near a group of strangers who had formed an impromptu circle. There was Mark Reynolds, a software engineer from Seattle, stranded on his way to a client meeting. Next to him sat Gloria and Richard Thompson, an elderly couple from Ohio, carrying homemade Christmas cookies in a tin that they had hoped to deliver to their granddaughter in Boston. The cookies became an unexpected gift for everyone who joined their small group. The atmosphere inside the airport shifted slowly. Frustration was still there. People worried about missed connections, hotel reservations, and Christmas gatherings. But something else began to emerge too, a sense of shared struggle. As the storm raged outside, conversations started, stories were exchanged, and for a moment, the travelers became a community, united by circumstances none of them could control. Emily wrapped her hands around a paper cup of coffee, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. She wasn't at home. She wasn't even where she was supposed to be, yet she was part of something unusual. Hundreds of strangers forced into the same long night, all waiting for the storm to let them go. And that was only the beginning of what unfolded inside Denver International Airport that night. The night deepened, and the storm outside showed no sign of mercy. Through the wide glass windows of the terminal, nothing could be seen but a thick, swirling whiteness. Snow pushed against the panes with every gust, making the inside of the airport feel almost like a snow globe, shaken endlessly by some unseen hand. The ground crews who had braved the storm earlier were nowhere to be found now. Even the blinking lights on the runways had disappeared, swallowed by the blizzard. Inside, the airport had transformed into a makeshift dormitory. Passengers spread jackets on the floor. Children slept on top of carry-on bags, and the constant hum of announcements gave way to a quieter, heavier silence as people settled into the realization that they would not be leaving that night. Emily glanced at the time on her phone. It was nearly midnight in Denver, which meant it was already early morning back in Birmingham. She thought of her parents, who had been expecting a message confirming she was on her way. Instead, she typed out a brief note. Stuck in Denver. Snowstorm. Will call when I can. The signal was weak, but eventually, the message slipped through. Mark, the software engineer, broke the silence of their little group. Well, he said, rubbing his hands together, I suppose this is a universe telling me I work too much. Maybe I should enjoy the break. His attempt at humor was met with tired but genuine smiles. Gloria, the elderly woman with the cookie tin, opened it once again and offered a piece to Emily. The sweetness was a small comfort, a reminder that even in an airport filled with strangers, kindness could soften the edges of a difficult night. Further down the terminal, a group of college students had started playing guitar. One of them strummed softly, and a few voices joined in, their song rising above the sound of the heating vents. The melody drifted through the space, and for a moment, it felt less like a storm had trapped them and more like they had all stumbled into some strange, unplanned gathering. Emily leaned back against her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, listening to the music. She thought of the difference between this and her usual life. Her carefully planned routines, her lessons prepared for students, her evenings spent with a cup of tea. Here, everything was uncertain. Time stretched oddly, like the storm had bent it, and there was no choice but to surrender. At around 2 in the morning, airport staff walked through the terminal handing out thin blankets and bottled water. Their faces were tired too, but they smiled politely, offering words of reassurance. Hang in there, folks. We're doing our best. One of them said, though no one really believed flights would resume before dawn. Emily wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and looked toward the glass again. The snow was still coming down, heavier than before. She turned to Richard, who had been sitting quietly, and asked, Have you ever seen a storm like this? He chuckled softly, shaking his head. I grew up in Ohio. We had our share of bad winters. But this is something else. It's the kind of storm that decides for you what your plans are going to be. The conversation carried on quietly. Mark talked about his travel for work, about the way airports had become second homes to him. Gloria shared stories of her granddaughter, the little girl who was supposed to receive the cookies. Emily listened, offering pieces of her own journey. Her trip along the California coast, the warmth of old friendships rekindled. It felt strange, opening up to people she had only met hours ago, yet the storm had broken down the usual walls. They were all, in a way, family for the night. By dawn, the storm still had not lifted. The terminal lights dimmed slightly as if the airport itself were exhausted. The guitar players were asleep now, their instrument resting beside them. Families stirred, children rubbing their eyes, asking the same question their parents were too tired to answer. When can we go? At 7 o'clock in the morning, an announcement came. Attention, passengers. The Denver area remains under severe weather conditions. Flights will remain suspended until further notice. We apologize for the continued delay. A collective groan spread through the terminal, followed by silence. People were past frustration now. Resignation had settled in. Emily stood and stretched her legs, deciding to walk the length of the terminal. As she passed rows of passengers bundled in coats, she noticed a variety of lives intersecting here. A businessman tapping furiously on his laptop, perhaps trying to salvage a deal. A mother soothing her baby with a lullaby. A group of teenagers laughing despite everything, playing cards on the floor. The airport was a cross-section of the world, all trapped in one place, all at the mercy of nature. She stopped near a window and pressed her palm against the cold glass. Outside, snowdrifts had piled high against the jet bridges. Planes sat frozen, their wings heavy with ice. Ground equipment was buried, their outlines just barely visible beneath the white. The storm was not letting go. Returning to her group, Emily found Mark sharing power from his portable charger with Gloria, who was struggling to keep her phone alive. "My son keeps calling," Gloria said with a laugh. "I keep telling him I'll be fine. We've got cookies, after all." They all chuckled, though their eyes betrayed the exhaustion. Later that morning, volunteers from the airport opened a section of the food court, providing free meals to stranded travelers. Lines stretched far, but the smell of hot breakfast lifted spirits. Emily carried back a tray of eggs and toast for the group. They ate together, their conversation slower now, punctuated by long silences. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the rhythm of people enduring something together. As the hours blurred into the afternoon, Emily realized how much the airport had become its own little world. People had created spaces, blankets arranged in circles, luggage stacked into makeshift barriers. Quiet corners claimed as temporary bedrooms. Conversations sprang up between strangers who would never have spoken otherwise. A sense of fragile community held them together. By the second night, the storm finally began to ease. Through the windows, the snow slowed, and distant lights from the runways flickered faintly once more. Hope returned, though cautious, like a bird testing the air after a storm. Announcements promised updates in the morning. Travelers clung to that promise, though no one dared to believe fully until they saw a plane take off. Emily lay back on her borrowed blanket, staring up at the high ceiling of the terminal. She thought about the strange way life had unfolded. She had come for a journey, and instead, she had found herself in a moment of suspended time, surrounded by people she never would have met otherwise. Her mind wandered to her students, her parents, the quiet streets of Birmingham. She imagined telling them this story someday, how she had been stranded in Denver, caught in the middle of a storm that felt endless. Beside her, Mark snored softly, his head resting on his bag. Gloria and Richard whispered to each other, their hands intertwined even after decades together. The airport hummed around them, filled with the sound of breathing, of waiting, of lives momentarily paused. And though the storm outside was nearly done, inside the airport the night was not yet over. What would come with the morning? Whether flights would resume, whether connections could be made, whether promises of reunions could still be kept, remained uncertain. For now, all they had was the shared quiet of another long night in Denver. The second night inside Denver International Airport dragged on like an endless stretch of muted hours. The overhead lights, never truly dimmed, made it difficult to tell what time it was. Time itself felt fractured, slipping between conversations, moments of restless sleep, and the hum of machines that never stopped. Emily stirred awake around 3 a.m. The floor beneath her was cold despite the blanket, and her neck ached from leaning against her backpack. She sat up slowly, blinking against the artificial brightness, and noticed that many people around her were still awake. A father paced back and forth with a baby pressed to his shoulder, whispering lullabies. A man in a business suit sat slumped over his laptop, the glow of the screen painting his face pale. Mark was awake too, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. He gave Emily a tired smile. "Still here," he said. His voice was dry with fatigue. "Still here," Emily echoed. She glanced toward Gloria and Richard, who were asleep with their hands clasped together. The sight warmed her, a reminder that even in exhaustion, there could be comfort. Around 4, the guitar players from the previous night stirred and began strumming again, softly, almost as if to chase away the heaviness. Their music filled the silence gently, and a few nearby travelers whispered thanks. As dawn approached, the storm outside finally seemed to break apart. The glass walls of the terminal revealed a sky still gray, but less violent. Snow had piled high, nearly burying the jet bridges, but at least the horizon was visible. For the first time in 2 days, light seeped through. By 7 o'clock, announcements returned with a new tone. "Attention passengers, Weather conditions have improved. Crews are working to clear runways. Some flights may resume later today. The message was met with cheers, claps, and sighs of relief. People stirred with new energy, though uncertainty still lingered. Emily stood with Mark, stretching stiff limbs. "Maybe we'll get out today," she said, though she wasn't sure she wanted to believe it. Mark shrugged. "I wouldn't bet my paycheck on it, but at least it's progress." The hours that followed were filled with the chaotic sound of movement. Airport staff rolled carts of food through the terminals. Volunteers distributed more blankets, and passengers formed lines at the counters, desperate for updates. Emily joined a line at the service desk, hoping to find information about her flight to New York. She waited nearly an hour, shuffling forward slowly, until she finally reached the counter. The agent, her eyes red with exhaustion, typed quickly before looking up. "Your flight's been rebooked for tomorrow morning," she explained. "Earliest we could manage." Emily sighed but thanked her. She walked back to her group, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor. "Tomorrow," she said simply, dropping into her seat. "That's better than nothing," Gloria said, ever the optimist. She reached for her tin, now half empty, and offered another cookie. By midday, the terminal had shifted in mood. Children played tag in the open spaces, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Adults exchanged stories, swapping details about where they had come from and where they were headed. Some complained loudly, others resigned themselves to the situation, but all were bound together by the storm's aftermath. Emily found herself talking with a young woman named Sarah, who had been trying to get to Chicago for a job interview. Sarah wore a red scarf and carried a notebook filled with sketches. She was an aspiring architect, as it turned out. The two shared coffee from a vending machine and compared notes on traveling through the United States. Emily realized how different their lives were, yet how similar their frustrations had become under the same roof. Later in the afternoon, Richard suggested they all take a walk around the terminal together. They moved slowly, passing the various makeshift camps people had built from luggage and blankets. One group had set up a circle of chairs and was playing cards. Another had dragged benches together to form a larger sleeping area. Everywhere they went, Emily noticed small signs of resilience. People sharing food, strangers lending chargers, children inventing games with whatever they could find. By evening, exhaustion returned, but it was different this time. There was hope now, a belief that tomorrow flights might finally take off. Emily curled beneath her blanket again, her head heavy, but her mind restless. She thought of the classrooms waiting for her back in Birmingham, the students who would ask about her trip, the way she would describe this strange experience of being stuck between journeys. The third night arrived. The storm outside had gone, but the aftermath kept them trapped still. Snowplows roared in the distance, lights flashing against the dark. Inside, people began preparing for departure in subtle ways, checking bags, packing blankets, charging devices, though no one yet knew if their flight would truly leave. Around 9, an unexpected sound broke through the terminal. Applause. Emily turned her head and saw a group of workers pushing open the doors to the tarmac, clearing a path. The sight of movement, of progress, ignited cheers. Travelers clapped, whistled. Some even shouted words of thanks. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was a promise. Emily smiled, her eyes bright despite fatigue. She turned to Mark. "Do you think this is it?" He shrugged, though he was smiling too. "I think tomorrow's going to be interesting." The night stretched on again, but now it carried a different weight. The waiting no longer felt endless. It felt like the last bend of a long road. Emily lay awake longer than she expected, listening to shifting sound around her. The rolling of carts, the shuffling of people preparing for sleep, the muffled laughter of children who still had energy to spare. She thought about how she had come to know these strangers, Mark with his dry humor, Gloria and Richard with their warmth, Sarah with her sketches, and how they had shared this peculiar chapter of life together. She realized that when the planes finally took off, when everyone went their separate ways, this moment would vanish as quickly as it had formed. They would return to their own lives, their own destinations, carrying only the memory of the storm that had forced them together. And yet, there was something beautiful about that, something she would not forget. The announcement board still glowed red with cancellations, but in the corner, a few letters had changed. Tomorrow, it read, tomorrow flights would resume. The airport grew quiet again, a hush falling over the sea of stranded travelers. Some slept deeply, others tossed restlessly. Outside, the snow lay heavy but still. The storm was over. The waiting was not. And as Emily closed her eyes, she wondered what tomorrow would bring. The third night in Denver International Airport passed slowly, though for many travelers, it carried a faint taste of anticipation. Sleep came in fragments, broken by announcements, by the shuffle of footsteps, by the sudden burst of laughter from someone too exhausted to hold back nerves. Emily drifted in and out of shallow dreams, each time waking to the same harsh fluorescent lights and the muffled sound of people breathing around her. At one point, around 2 a.m, she rose from the cold floor and walked toward the vast glass windows at the end of the terminal. Outside, floodlights illuminated crews plowing the runways, their vehicles crawling like tiny insects against a mountain of snow. The sight reassured her. Progress was being made. When she returned to her makeshift spot, she found Gloria awake, adjusting the blanket around her husband's shoulders. Emily crouched down beside her. Can't sleep either? Gloria smiled gently, her lined face calm despite fatigue. Not really. My Richard sleeps anywhere. But me, I always wake up when I know we're not where we're supposed to be. Emily nodded, understanding perfectly. Do you think you'll make it to Boston? Oh, we will, Gloria said firmly. Might be a day late, but our granddaughter's not going anywhere. She'll get her cookies, and she'll know her grandparents didn't give up. The determination in her voice settled something in Emily's heart. She laid down again, pulling the blanket closer, and let her mind wander to her own destination. Home, Birmingham. She imagined the familiar smell of her parents' kitchen, the way the kettle always seemed to be on, the sound of rain against the small windows of her childhood bedroom. That picture in her mind was enough to lull her back into a restless sleep. Morning finally arrived. The overhead announcement jolted people awake at exactly 7. Good morning, passengers. We are pleased to inform you that limited flights will resume today. Please check your airline counters for updated departure information. The word were met with cheers, claps, and even a few tears. Families hugged, children squealed, and adults rushed to their phones to call loved ones. For the first time in days, the airport felt alive again, not just surviving but moving forward. Emily stood quickly, her heart pounding with relief. Mark grinned beside her, though his eyes were still bleary from lack of sleep. We made it, he said. They said limited flights. Emily reminded him cautiously. It might take time. Still, he replied, it's something. The group walked together toward the departure boards, weaving through crowds that were suddenly more animated than before. Lines formed quickly, people jostling with renewed urgency. The once muted terminal was now filled with voices rising over each other, questions directed at staff, and the sound of rolling suitcases pulled back into service. Emily checked the screen for her flight to New York. It was still marked as delayed, but no longer canceled. A small green label blinked beside it. Rescheduled. Departure time, 9:45 in the morning. She let out a shaky laugh. I can't believe it. I might actually get out today. Gloria clapped her on the arm. There you go, love. You'll be on your way before lunch. The hours between the announcement and the actual boarding stretched long again, but this time with a different energy. People packed their blankets, folded jackets, and tried to smooth out the wrinkles of days spent sleeping on floors. Children were dressed in fresh clothes, hair brushed hurriedly by tired parents. The scent of brewed coffee filled the terminal as cafes reopened, serving lines of customers desperate for something hot. Emily and her companions shared one last breakfast together, seated around a small table near a cafe. Sarah, the aspiring architect of the red scarf, showed Emily her sketches again, flipping through drawings of buildings imagined and real. Mark told a dry joke about surviving airport camping, and even Richard laughed, his eyes crinkling. It was strange, Emily thought, how quickly people could become part of one another's lives. When boarding was finally called for Emily's flight, her stomach fluttered with both excitement and sadness. She gathered her bag, tightening the strap over her shoulder, and turned to face the group. Well, she began, this is it. Gloria rose slowly, taking Emily's hands. Safe travels, dear. Tell your family you met an old couple in Denver who still believe in cookies. Emily laughed, though her eyes stung. I will. Thank you for everything. Mark gave her a nod. See you on the other side of the Atlantic. Maybe. Who knows? Maybe, Emily replied. Smiling, Sarah hugged her briefly, whispering, Good luck with the rest of your journey. And then it was time. Emily walked toward the gate, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Behind her, the others watched for a moment before turning back to their own uncertain departures. The boarding process was slow, as if the airport itself wasn't quite ready to let go of its captives. But eventually, Emily found herself seated near the window of the plane, staring out at the snow-covered tarmac. Workers moved steadily, guiding planes into position, clearing paths. The engines hummed to life, vibrating through the cabin. As the plane began to taxi, Emily pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She could see the terminal shrinking in the distance, the very walls that had held her for 3 long days. She thought of the guitar players, the children sleeping on jackets, the strangers who had become companions. She thought of how everyone had carried a different story, yet all had been bound together by the storm. The plane paused at the edge of the runway, engines roaring louder. For a moment, Emily held her breath. Then, with a shudder, the aircraft surged forward, wheels lifting slowly from the snow-packed ground. The runway fell away beneath her, and Denver, wrapped in white, became smaller and smaller. Relief swept through the cabin, a collective exhale. Passengers clapped quietly, some whispering prayers of thanks. Emily closed her eyes, letting the vibration of the climb wash over her. She was leaving, finally, but the memory of those nights in the airport would remain. Hours later, as the plane cruised high above the clouds, Emily opened her notebook and began to write. She didn't usually keep a journal, but this felt like something she needed to capture. She wrote about the storm, the stranded nights, the people she had met, the cookies, the laughter, the waiting, the way strangers had become something more. She didn't know if she would ever see any of them again, but perhaps that wasn't the point. Perhaps the point was that, for a brief time, in a place built for departures and arrivals, they had all stopped moving and shared a life together. Emily looked out the window again. The sky was a pale blue, endless and calm, nothing like the storm that trapped her days before. Somewhere ahead lay New York, and after that, home. Yet even as the miles stretched beneath her, part of her remained in Denver, in that strange world of endless lights and waiting, where a winter storm had forced hundreds of travelers to pause and discover each other in the quiet in-between. And though the journey continued, Emily knew that chapter was not truly finished. Not yet. The hours dragged on inside Denver International Airport, and the blizzard outside showed no sign of easing. By now, it was nearly midnight. The terminal lights glared against the glass walls, reflecting the exhausted faces of hundreds of travelers who had resigned themselves to another night on the floor or in plastic chairs that were never meant for sleeping. Snow continued to fall in heavy sheets, coating the runways in white, while the sound of the wind whistling outside the building reminded everyone just how dangerous the storm had become. Mark sat near gate C-32, clutching his phone that was down to 20% battery. He had been trying to call his wife back in St. Louis to reassure her that he was safe, though he hadn't managed to find a quiet corner for conversation. Every part of the terminal buzzed with restless voices, crying children, and the crackle of announcements that only seemed to say the same thing. All flights canceled until further notice. Beside him, Emily, the young woman he had met hours earlier, was curled up with her backpack as a pillow. She had fallen asleep for a while, but now stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. "Still nothing?" she asked softly, nodding toward the monitors displaying flight information. "Still nothing," Mark replied, glancing at the endless rows of red text flashing canceled. "It's like the storm doesn't want to let go." Emily gave a faint laugh, though it sounded more like a sigh. "This is my first time being snowed in at an airport. Guess I picked the wrong day to travel." "You and me both," Mark said. He checked the time again. 12:07 a.m., somewhere between the hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of tired footsteps. The hours had blurred. On the other side of the terminal, a group of stranded college students had turned their misfortune into a kind of impromptu sleepover. They spread jackets and blankets across the floor, passing around bags of pretzels and playing music from a Bluetooth speaker. Their laughter cut through the dreary silence, and for a brief moment, it made the terminal feel less like a waiting room for disaster. Nearby, an elderly couple, Tom and Margaret, sat together quietly. Tom was bundled in his long coat, while Margaret held a crossword puzzle book, her pencil resting between her fingers. Every now and then, Tom would point something out on the puzzle, and she would fill in the letters carefully, as if the storm outside was just a passing inconvenience rather than the frightening force it really was. The airport staff did what they could. Volunteers walked through the gates handing out thin silver emergency blankets and bottled water. A makeshift charging station had been set up with extension cords snaking across the floor. Lines at the vending machines stretched long, and many of them were already empty. Around 1 a.m., Mark wandered toward the large glass windows near the end of the terminal. He pressed his forehead to the cold glass, staring out into the swirling snow. The runway lights glowed faintly in the distance, though the storm nearly swallowed them whole. The sheer force of nature humbled him. No matter how advanced planes and technology had become, here they all were, helpless against the sky's fury. Emily joined him a few minutes later, pulling her blanket tightly around her shoulders. "It's strange," she murmured. "All these people from different places, different lives, and suddenly we're stuck here together, like the storm decided we should all pause at the same time." Mark nodded. "Makes you realize how small the world really is. Or maybe how fragile our plans are." Behind them, an announcement echoed over the loudspeaker. "Attention passengers. Due to severe weather conditions, all flights remain grounded. Please be advised that cots will be distributed in the main concourse. Thank you for your patience." A collective groan rose from the crowd, but also a ripple of relief. At least there would be somewhere softer to rest. Groups of passengers shuffled toward the concourse, dragging luggage behind them. Mark and Emily followed the stream of people, weaving through tired travelers. By the time they reached the concourse, airport staff were unloading stacks of foldable cots. People lined up to claim them, setting them in neat rows across the floor. The sight was surreal, an indoor campsite beneath towering ceilings, with strangers becoming temporary neighbors. The hum of conversation mixed with the crinkle of blankets and the squeak of cot legs on tile. Mark helped Emily set up her cot beside his. Across from them, the elderly couple, Tom and Margaret, arranged theirs side by side, while the college students gathered theirs in a circle, joking that they had created a fort. The storm raged on outside, unseen but always heard. Each gust of wind rattled the windows faintly, reminding everyone of the world beyond the glass. Yet inside, a strange sense of community began to grow. Around 2:30 a.m., someone pulled out a deck of cards and invited others to join. A circle formed around one of the cots, and laughter soon followed as the game unfolded. A man in a business suit, who hours earlier had been pacing angrily while arguing on his phone, now leaned forward with a smile, shuffling the deck with surprising skill. Emily tugged on Mark's sleeve. "You want to play?" she asked. Mark shook his head with a small grin. "Maybe later. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all this. Feels like I'm in a movie." Emily chuckled. "Well, at least it's not a horror movie. More like a survival drama with a weirdly wholesome twist." The night crept forward. Some people managed to sleep, while others whispered quietly in small groups. Mark found himself unable to rest. He lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling beam stretching high above, listening to the sound of the terminal, an orchestra of snores, murmurs, and distant announcements. He thought of his wife, of how worried she must be waiting for him to return. He thought of how fragile travel plans seem when confronted with forces beyond control. He thought of Emily, too, this stranger who now felt oddly familiar after only a few hours of shared uncertainty. By the time dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, faint light creeping through the massive windows, the storm still showed little sign of letting up. The snow had piled into great drifts outside, burying vehicles and making the runways invisible. Yet inside the terminal, the travelers had formed a kind of fragile peace. Mark sat up on his cot, stretching his sore back. Around him, people stirred awake, yawning and rubbing their eyes. The airport staff moved quietly, offering coffee and paper cups to those awake. Emily sipped hers slowly, blowing on the steam. "It feels like we've been here for days," she said softly. Mark nodded. "And who knows how much longer we'll be here?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. Would the blizzard finally break? Or would the travelers of Denver International Airport find themselves bound together for yet another day of waiting? The answer remained uncertain. But for now, life inside the storm's grasp went on. The second day inside Denver International Airport began with a cold, gray light seeping in through the giant glass walls. Snow was still falling heavily, though the flakes were now smaller, like an endless curtain drifting from the sky. The blizzard showed no mercy, and the runways remained buried under thick drifts of white. The loudspeaker made the announcement everyone dreaded around 7:15 in the morning. All flights grounded until further notice. A groan rippled through the concourse. Some passengers pulled blankets over their heads and tried to return to sleep, while others sat up with heavy sighs, stretching stiff muscles from another night on cots. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, mixed with the aroma of fast food from the few restaurants still open. Mark rubbed his eyes, staring across the makeshift sea of cots where travelers were now beginning to stir. Emily sat beside him, brushing her hair back and glancing toward the windows. "Still snowing," she whispered. "Still snowing," Mark echoed. He had lost track of how many times he had repeated those words. The elderly couple, Tom and Margaret, were already awake. Margaret was carefully folding their thin blankets, while Tom walked slowly to the charging station to retrieve his phone. He returned with a small smile. "Still no flights, but my daughter in Phoenix says the sun is shining down there," he told Margaret, trying to lighten the mood. A few feet away, the group of college students had managed to keep spirits alive. They were crowded together, sipping coffee and laughing as one of them retold a story about a road trip gone wrong. Their energy was contagious, drawing tired smiles from nearby travelers. Mark decided to stretch his legs, wandering down the terminal corridor. He passed people curled up in awkward positions on chairs, others pacing with phones pressed to their ears, and children playing tag between the rows of cots. The strange thing was how normal it was beginning to feel, this temporary life inside the airport, cut off from the outside world by walls of snow and ice. At 9 a.m., airport staff rolled out carts with granola bars, bottled water, and apples. The line stretched long, but most people waited patiently, grateful for something fresh to eat. Mark grabbed 2 bottles of water and handed one to Emily when he returned. "Thanks," she said with a tired smile. She bit into an apple, chewing slowly as she stared out the window. "You know what this feels like? Like we're in some kind of experiment. How long can strangers survive together in a sealed building while the world outside disappears?" Mark chuckled. "Well, so far we're surviving. Barely." By mid-morning, the storm had intensified again. The windows shook occasionally with gusts of wind, and outside there was nothing to see but a wall of white. The snowplows that had been clearing paths on the tarmac the previous day were now motionless, buried themselves. Inside, passengers began forming small communities. A mother with 2 children asked if anyone had extra snacks, and within minutes, several people offered crackers and cookies from their bags. A young man pulled out a guitar and strummed softly, his music echoing gently through the concourse. Even those who had been grumbling the loudest the night before seemed to soften under the shared weight of waiting. Mark and Emily found themselves drawn into conversation with Tom and Margaret. The couple spoke about their 50 years of marriage, about the time they had once been stranded in Chicago during a storm in the 1970s, though back then there were no cots or emergency blankets handed out. "We slept on the floor with our coats as pillows," Margaret recalled, smiling faintly. "This feels almost luxurious in comparison." As the day dragged on, time seemed to blur again. Noon passed without much notice. People moved slowly, conserving energy. The restaurants that remained open had long lines stretching out into the walkways, and many travelers opted instead for vending machine snacks. The supply of cots had run out during the night, so newcomers arriving on canceled flights were forced to find spots on the floor, curling up against their luggage. By late afternoon, rumors spread quickly. Someone claimed they had heard flights might resume by evening. Others insisted the storm would last another full day. Mark overheard heated arguments near the information desk, frustrated passengers demanding answers from staff who could only shrug helplessly. Emily sighed when she heard the same whispers. "Hope feels dangerous in here. Every time someone says we might leave soon, it only makes it worse when we don't." Mark nodded. "Maybe it's better to just accept we're here, for however long it takes." As evening descended, the airport lights brightened once more, casting long shadows across the concourse. The storm still raged outside. Through the glass walls, Denver itself was invisible, buried silence, and cut off. At 7 p.m., airport staff began setting up another round of cots for new arrivals. More blankets, more water bottles. The crowd was larger now than the day before, and the building buzzed with the energy of too many lives squeezed together. Yet there was also an odd sense of unity, a shared struggle binding them. That night, Mark found himself unable to sleep again. He sat awake, watching as people dozed around him, listening to the storm howl outside. Emily shifted on her cot and opened her eyes. "Can't sleep?" she whispered. "Not really," Mark admitted. She sat up, pulling her blanket closer. "I keep thinking about how weird it's going to feel when we finally leave. How we'll all scatter back into our lives and never see each other again. But for now, it feels like we're stuck in the same story." Mark thought about that for a long time, staring at the snow pressed against the windows. She was right. For now, every person in the airport was part of the same strange chapter, trapped between their past and their future. The blizzard outside roared on, making sure none of them could leave just yet. And as the second night settled in, the travelers of Denver International Airport surrendered once more to waiting, not knowing when the storm would finally loosen its grip. Day 3 inside Denver International Airport began with silence that was almost eerie. For the first time since the blizzard had started, the snow was no longer slamming against the windows in furious waves. Instead, the flakes drifted slowly, gently, like feathers falling from the sky. Yet the runways were still buried under several feet of snow, and no planes were moving. The loudspeaker announcement at 6:30 a.m. confirmed what everyone suspected. All flights were still canceled, with no guarantee of departure until conditions improved. A few groans and muffled curses echoed through the concourse, but most passengers simply sighed, having grown used to disappointment. By now, nearly everyone had settled into a strange routine of airport survival. Mark sat up on his cot, stretching stiffly. His back ached, and his phone battery hovered at only 7% despite rationing it carefully. Emily, beside him, had been writing in a small notebook. She smiled faintly when she noticed him awake. "Morning," she said softly. "Or whatever we call mornings here." "Morning," Mark replied with a tired laugh. "How long have you been up?" "Since 4, she admitted. "Couldn't sleep, so I started writing. Just notes, really. What it's like to be stuck here. The people I've met." Mark nodded, glancing around the concourse. The makeshift community had grown. Families, students, business travelers, retirees, all thrown together by the storm. There were more cots than ever, lined up neatly in rows like a temporary village. Tom and Margaret were awake as well, quietly sharing a thermos of tea they had carried from home. Margaret handed Mark a small cup, her face warm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "This helps," she said kindly. "A little comfort in a place that doesn't give much of it." The storm may have calmed, but the consequences of 3 days stranded were beginning to show. Tempers flared more often now. A man at the information desk raised his voice when told no flights would leave that morning. A mother scolded her restless children too harshly. Lines for food grew longer, with some restaurants running out of supplies. By mid-morning, the airport staff tried to lift spirits by opening a children's activity area near the center of the concourse. Bright mats were spread on the floor, and crayons and coloring books were provided. The sound of children's laughter slowly filled the air, easing the tension around them. Travelers passing by couldn't help but smile at the sight. Emily and Mark wandered toward the windows again. The blizzard's fury had lessened, but the view outside was still daunting. Mountains of snow lined the runways, with plows struggling to cut narrow paths through them. The horizon was a blur of white under a pale sky. "It looks like another world out there," Emily murmured. "Like the airport is an island," Mark replied, "and everything beyond it doesn't exist anymore." They stood quietly for a while, watching the snowplows move slowly across the endless white. Behind them, conversations rose and fell in a dozen different accents and tones, a reminder of how many lives had intersected here by chance. In the afternoon, something remarkable happened. A group of musicians, stranded like everyone else, set up near one of the wide hallways. With a violin, a guitar, and a small drum, they began to play. At first, only a few travelers stopped to listen, but soon a circle formed and the music spread warm through the cold space. People clapped along. Some even danced. Emily swayed with the rhythm, her face brighter than Mark had seen in days. "See," she said, her voice rising over the notes. "We can make something out of this, even if it's just a memory of music in the middle of the storm." Mark found himself smiling too, the tension in his shoulders easing. For a brief moment, the airport didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a gathering place, a shared pause in so many different journeys. Even Tom and Margaret joined the crowd, clapping in rhythm. The college students cheered loudly, recording performance on their phones. A man in a business suit, who had spent most of the first night pacing angrily with calls to his office, now tapped his foot in time with the beat. As the music carried them through the late afternoon, the sense of community grew stronger. Strangers exchanged names, stories, even jokes. People shared snacks they had saved, while others offered to watch children so parents could rest. But when evening arrived, the familiar announcement returned. Flight still grounded. This time, the disappointment felt heavier. People had begun to hope again when the storm lightened, only to find themselves still stuck. Mark and Emily lay on their cots that night, staring at the ceiling. The concourse buzzed softly with murmurs and the occasional cough. The storm outside had weakened, but uncertainty weighed more than the snow itself. "Do you think tomorrow will be different?" Emily asked quietly. Mark hesitated. "I want to say yes, but I don't know." Emily pulled her blanket tighter, her notebook resting on her chest. "I think I'll keep writing. If nothing else, it feels like we're living in a story, and stories are worth remembering." Mark turned his head toward her, watching the determination in her tired eyes. "Maybe you're right. Maybe when we finally leave, this will be the part we talk about most. Not where we were headed, but what happened when we couldn't get there." Outside, the night stretched long. Snow still drifted down, though more softly than before. The runways remained buried. But inside the airport, people clung to small acts of kindness and the fragile hope that the storm would end soon. Day 3 closed much as it had begun, with uncertainty, exhaustion, and the shared reality of hundreds of lives bound together by snow. And as Mark drifted into restless sleep, the question lingered in the air. Would Day 4 finally bring the first glimpse of departure, or was the storm not yet finished with them? Day 4 inside Denver International Airport began not with an announcement over the loudspeakers, but with the sound of dozens of footsteps echoing across the concourse. Mark stirred awake, sitting up slowly, his body sore from another night on the cot. Around him, travelers were gathering near the large windows, pointing outside. He rubbed his eyes, curious, then stood to see what had changed. The storm had finally broken. The sky, for the first time in days, was a pale blue streaked with clouds. Sunlight reflected off the massive drifts of snow, dazzling and harsh. Snowplows were still working furiously, cutting channels through the runways, but the horizon stretched open, no longer hidden by walls of white. Emily stood beside him, her hair messy from sleep, but her eyes wide with wonder. "It looks different," she whispered, her breath fogging against the glass. Mark nodded. "It looks alive again." Hope spread to the concourse like a spark catching dry tinder. Strangers exchanged excited looks, some even clapping quietly. The news, however, was not immediate. At 8:15 a.m., the familiar voice came over the intercom. "Attention passengers. While the storm is cleared, runways remain closed until further notice as crews continue snow removal. Please remain patient. We will provide updates as soon as possible." The announcement was met with mixed emotions. Relief that the storm was finally over. Frustration that the wait would continue. And beneath it all, exhaustion that 4 days of limbo had carved into every face. Tom and Margaret joined Mark and Emily by the windows. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she leaned on her cane, but her eyes glistened with a quiet smile. "It's like waking from a long dream," she said softly. "We might actually get to leave soon." The college students, clustered together in their circle of cots, cheered when they saw the sunlight. One of them shouted, "First plane out, we're on it," though none of them truly believed departures would happen quickly. By late morning, rumors spread again. Some claimed that regional flights might resume by the evening. Others insisted it would take 2 more days for full operations to return. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Still, the sight of clear skies gave strength where words could not. Mark and Emily decided to walk the terminal to stretch their legs. They passed the children's activity corner, where kids now drew pictures of airplanes taking off into blue skies. Parents encouraged them gently, perhaps as much for their own hope as for the children's. A man with a camera walked slowly through the concourse, capturing images of stranded travelers smiling for the first time in days. By noon, the mood had shifted. With sunlight pouring to the high windows, the airport felt less like a shelter and more like a departure gate once again. People cleaned their spaces, folding blankets and stacking cots neatly. Conversations turned to where they were headed, what they would do when they finally arrived. Emily scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing every detail. She looked up at Mark and said, "If I ever publish these notes, I'll call it the winter we couldn't leave. What do you think?" Mark smiled faintly. "I think people will read it, because we're all living it right now." The hours passed slowly, but with more energy than the days before. The musicians in the previous afternoon played again, this time upbeat songs that drew larger crowds. Strangers danced in small circles, clapping and laughing. A man who had spent the first night angry and restless now held his toddler in his arms, swaying to the music with a peaceful smile. But as evening fell, the announcement returned once more. "Attention passengers. Runway clearing continues, but no flights will depart tonight. Please prepare for another overnight stay. We appreciate your continued patience." The disappointment was heavy, though less sharp than before. The travelers had grown resilient. Some groaned, some cursed under their breath, but most accepted the reality. The storm had broken, but its grip lingered. Mark and Emily sat together on their cots, sipping the last of the bottled water. Around them, the airport hummed with quieter voices than the night before. Tom and Margaret were already asleep, holding hands beneath their thin blankets. The college students had quieted, their laughter replaced with tired murmurs. "I thought today would be the day," Emily whispered. "So did I," Mark admitted. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams high above. "But maybe tomorrow." Emily closed her notebook, resting it on her lap. "Do you think we'll all remember this? The people, the days stuck here, the storm outside?" Mark turned his head to look at her. "I think we'll never forget it. How could we? This is the kind of thing that marks time. A before and an after." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the cleaning machines moving slowly across the polished floor. Outside, the runways gleamed faintly under floodlights, still lined with snow, but now edged with dark patches of asphalt where plows had succeeded. As midnight approached, a calm settled over the concourse. The storm was gone. The sky was clear. Yet the waiting continued, pressing heavily on every traveler inside. Mark drifted into sleep with one final thought echoing in his mind. Tomorrow might be the day. But until then, the airport remained their world, suspended between journeys, a place where strangers became companions and the storm became their captor. And so day 4 ended, not with resolution, but with a fragile thread of hope stretched taut across the night. Day 5 inside Denver International Airport began with a kind of nervous electricity in the air. By now, most of the stranded travelers were running on very little energy, but as the sun came up and flooded to the tall windows, something felt different. The sky was clear. The horizon stretched far and sharp against the mountains, and most importantly, the sound of snowplows was constant, steady, and determined. Mark woke to the chatter of voices near the information desk. He rubbed his eyes, sat up on his cot, and saw clusters of people pointing toward the digital monitors. Emily stirred beside him, blinking sleepily. "What is it?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Check the board," Mark said, standing to get a closer look. For the first time in 5 long days, a single word appeared beside one of the flight numbers. Scheduled. Not canceled. Not delayed indefinitely. Scheduled. A ripple spread across the concourse as people noticed. Some clapped, others cheered softly, and a few travelers even began to cry, the weight of endless waiting breaking under the possibility of departure. Emily's eyes widened as she read the monitor. It's real. They're actually scheduling flights again. Mark smiled, though it was a weary smile, the kind that carried 5 days of doubt. It looks like we might finally get out of here. The announcement over the loudspeaker came at 8:45 a.m. The voice, calm but firm as before, said, "Attention passengers. Denver International Airport will begin limited departures today. Please check your flight status regularly, as schedules are subject to change. We thank you for your patience." The concourse erupted in chatter. Some people rushed to the counters, desperate to confirm their flights. Others stayed back, clutching their phones and refreshing apps for updates. Tom and Margaret shuffled over, their faces glowing with cautious hope. Margaret's hands trembled as she held her boarding pass. "We might actually see our daughter tomorrow," she whispered, as though afraid the moment would dissolve if she spoke too loudly. The college students, still huddled together, erupted in cheers. "We're going home," one shouted, throwing his arms around his friends. But the reality was more complicated. Flights were scheduled, yes, but only a handful. The backlog of passengers was enormous. Not everyone would leave right away. Some would stay another day, maybe longer. Mark checked his phone nervously. His flight to St. Louis remained marked as canceled. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. Emily glanced at her own ticket to Portland and sighed. Mine still canceled too. They sat down together, the joy around them bittersweet. For every traveler celebrating, another was still waiting. By late morning, the first plane since the storm finally taxied down a partially cleared runway. People pressed against the windows to watch, some raising their phones to record. The plane's wheels lifted off the ground, slicing into the blue sky, and a wave of applause swept through the concourse. It was a symbol more than anything else, proof that escape was possible. Emily's eyes glistened as she watched the plane disappear. "That could be us soon," she said quietly. Mark nodded, though the knot in his chest tightened. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. The rest of the day unfolded in a strange mixture of hope and disappointment. More flights appeared on the boards, but most were delayed again as crews worked tirelessly to clear snow. Lines at the counters stretched endlessly, with staff doing their best to rebook passengers in order priority. Frustrations flared, but were tempered by the sight of planes finally moving. In the afternoon, Mark and Emily walked together through the terminal. They passed travelers who were hugging goodbye to strangers they had befriended during the storm, exchanging phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. A man from New Mexico gave his last spare blanket to a young mother headed for Chicago. The musicians played once more, this time with brighter, livelier songs, celebrating the slow return to normalcy. At one point, Emily stopped at the window and pressed her hand to the glass. Beyond the runways, the Rockies loomed sharp and proud against the horizon, bathed in sunlight. "I've never seen mountains look so alive," she said. "It feels like the storm washed the world clean." Mark stood beside her, feeling the warmth of the sun through the glass. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to imagine walking off a plane, hugging his wife, returning home. But as evening came, reality settled again. His flight remained canceled. Emily's too. They would spend at least one more night in the airport, even as others departed. The concourse thinned slightly as the first groups of lucky passengers boarded planes, but hundreds remained behind. Mark lay on his cot, staring at the beams above, listening to the hum of the airport that had become oddly familiar. Emily sat cross-legged beside him, scribbling in her notebook by the dim light of her phone. "You know," she said after a long silence, "I think this is the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. 5 days in an airport, with people I didn't know, and now I feel like I can't imagine not knowing them." Mark smiled faintly. "I was just thinking the same thing. We're strangers, but we've lived through something together. That makes us, I don't know, connected." She set her notebook down and looked at him. "When we finally leave, do you think we'll keep in touch? Or will this just be one of those stories we tell, with faces we never see again?" Mark thought for a moment, the sound of a departing plane rumbling faintly in the distance. "I hope we keep in touch. But even if we don't, I'll remember this. I'll remember you, and everyone else." Emily smiled softly, pulling her blanket up around her shoulders. "Me too." The night stretched long, but lighter than before. The storm was over. The sky was clear, and though the wait was not yet done, hope filled the concourse like the hum of an engine ready to roar to life. Day 5 closed not with despair, but with anticipation. Tomorrow, perhaps, the monitors would show their names beside flights marked scheduled. Tomorrow, perhaps, their turn would come. The snow outside glittered in the moonlight, no longer a wall, but a landscape waiting to be crossed. And inside the airport, the stranded travelers settled in for what they prayed would be their last night together. The 6th day at Denver International Airport began with a different feeling in the air. The sun finally broke through the heavy clouds, casting a pale golden light across the glass walls of the terminal. The floor still carried patches of snow and slush, dragged in by restless shoes, but there was something lighter in the atmosphere. The sound of cleaning machines hummed in the distance, mixing with the clearer, more deliberate announcements over the loudspeakers. For the first time in days, it felt as though the airport was regaining control. Mark woke earlier than usual. His eyes felt heavy, but an urge pushed him toward the giant departure boards. He rose from the thin blanket he had been using as his bed and moved quickly past rows of chairs that had become his temporary home. A small crowd already gathered in front of the glowing screen. He scanned line after line until his gaze locked on the words he had been waiting for. His flight to St. Louis was no longer marked canceled. It read scheduled, with a departure time set for that afternoon. He stood motionless, needing to read it twice, maybe 3 times, to believe it. Around him, voices rose in small bursts of excitement. Flights were beginning to move again, and this time his name was on the list. Emily appeared minutes later, her hair slightly tangled, a jacket draped loosely over one arm. She saw his expression and turned toward the board. Her smile lit up instantly. "Finally," she whispered, eyes wide with relief. But when she checked her own flight, her smile faltered. Portland still wasn't listed. Mark looked at her, guilt mixing with relief. "Mine's leaving this afternoon," he said quietly. Emily nodded, trying not to let her disappointment show. "That's good, Mark. You've been waiting too long. At least one of us gets to leave." Her voice was steady, but there was a pause in it, a weight hidden between words. 5 days of sharing the same uncertainty had made them more than strangers. They had shared meals, stories, and the silence of waiting. Now, one of them was about to move forward, while the other stayed behind. By midday, the terminal was alive with movement. Lines stretched across counters. Families clung to one another with tears of relief when they heard their names called, while others slumped in defeat as new delays rolled across the screens. Mark and Emily sat side by side in a quiet corner, chewing on the last pieces of bread given out by volunteers. It was bland, but it filled the emptiness. "If I could, I'd trade my ticket so we could leave together," Mark murmured. Emily turned her head, forcing a smile. "Don't be foolish. You've got people waiting. You need to go home." He dropped his gaze, his fingers crumpling the bread wrapper. He knew she was right, but it didn't make it easier. At noon sharp, Mark's name echoed through the loudspeakers. It was time. His heart pounded as he rose to his feet. He looked at Emily one last time. "Looks like it's my turn," he said. She stood too, her smile faint but her eyes glassy. "Yes, it is. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." He hesitated, then reached for her hand. The grip was brief, almost awkward, but full of meaning. "Thank you for everything. I wouldn't have made it through these days without you." Emily swallowed hard. "Me too. Safe travels, Mark." His steps toward the gate felt heavier than they should. He handed over his boarding pass, walked down the long corridor, and turned once more. In the distance, through the crowd, Emily raised her hand in a quiet wave. Inside the plane, Mark sank into a window seat. He watched the wings stretch across a runway lined with piles of snow glistening under the sun. The engines roared. The plane rumbled forward, and as it lifted into the clear winter sky, a strange emptiness filled his chest. Relief was there he was going home, but it was tangled with the ache of leaving something unspoken behind. Back in the terminal, Emily lowered herself into a chair once again. She pulled out the small notebook she always carried and began to write. The words came easily, as if she needed to capture every detail before they slipped away. She wrote about the elderly couple from Ohio who carried cookies for their granddaughter, about the college students who played music in the middle of the night to keep spirits alive, about the airport staff who smiled through exhaustion, and of course, about Mark, the man who had arrived a stranger and left a trace that would not fade. Night fell again over Denver. The crowds were thinner now, as some had finally escaped, but hundreds still remained. Emily wrapped herself in her blanket, closed her eyes, and wished that tomorrow her name would appear on the board. On the 7th morning, the sky was clear once more, and there it was, her flight to Portland, finally listed, departure at 11 a.m. Her heart raced as she double-checked the gate number. She rushed to the counter, her hands trembling as she received her boarding pass. Waiting at the gate, Emily couldn't help but think of Mark. Was he already home? Had he hugged his wife, told her about the teacher from Birmingham who sat with him through 5 nights of chaos? When her name was called, she walked the long corridor to the plane. In her seat, she looked out the window. The snow was melting, puddles glimmering in the sunlight. The engines rumbled beneath her feet, and in moments she was in the air, rising above the airport that had held her captive for a week. From above, Denver shrank, but the memories remained, not just of the storm that unraveled plans for thousands, but the way strangers became companions, how they endured together, and how small moments of kindness carved warmth into the coldest days. In 2 different cities, Mark and Emily returned to their lives. But airports would never feel the same again. Whenever they passed through another terminal, whenever they heard the word delay or saw snow begin to fall, the memory returned, the storm that bound them together, even if only for a short time. And somehow, beneath all the weariness, there was a quiet warmth that never fully disappeared. Weeks passed, and the memory of Denver lingered in both Mark and Emily's lives like a faint echo they could not entirely silence. For Mark, return to Seattle brought a strange sense of normalcy, yet every time he passed through the living room where his suitcase still sat half unpacked, he thought of the long nights in the airport terminal. His wife, Sarah, noticed the distant look in his eyes when he spoke of the trip. He had told her about the storm, about the cancellations, about the endless rows of people sleeping on chairs. But he hadn't told her everything. He hadn't told her about Emily, the English teacher who had quietly become the anchor of his stranded days. One evening in January, while sipping coffee after dinner, Sarah asked, "What was the worst part of it?" "Being stuck, I mean." Mark paused, staring into the steam rising from his mug. "The waiting," he answered, not knowing what would end. But the people helped. We weren't alone in it. He did mention how one person in particular had made the waiting bearable, how her voice had softened the harsh echoes of delay after delay. He kept that tucked away, not out of guilt exactly, but because it felt too fragile to expose. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Emily returned to Birmingham. The familiar gray skies of England greeted her, and soon she was back in her classroom, chalk in hand, surrounded by the chatter of students. Yet when she looked at their young faces, her mind often drifted back to the airport. She remembered the elderly couple sharing cookies, the student strumming a guitar, and Mark sitting beside her with tired eyes that somehow always managed to smile. At night, she opened her notebook and reread the pages she had filled during the storm. The words carried her back to the concourse, to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the scent of coffee from the all-night kiosks. She lingered on the passages about Mark, though she never said his name aloud. It felt strange, writing about someone she might never see again, but also comforting. He had been real, even if only for a handful of nights. By February, Denver had faded for most people who had been trapped there. It became another story, one they told at dinner parties or family gatherings, the week when snow grounded everything. But for Emily and Mark, it wasn't just a story. It was a thread tugging at the corners of their thoughts. On a quiet Sunday evening, Emily found herself scrolling through her phone. She remembered how Mark had mentioned once, almost in passing, that he worked in software development and often attended conferences. He had spoken of a project in St. Louis, and another in Boston scheduled for the spring. Emily typed his name into the search bar on LinkedIn. There were many Mark Reynolds, but after a few minutes, she found him, his photo matched, and his profile listed Seattle as home. Her heart raced. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Should she send a message? Would it be inappropriate? Too forward? She closed the app, set the phone aside, and tried to distract herself with a book. But the thought lingered. 3 days later, she gave in. She wrote a short message. Hello, Mark. I don't know if you remember me. It's Emily from Denver Airport in December. I just want to say I hope you made it home safely, and that the storm is now just a strange memory for you. Take care. She stared at it, deleted it, rewrote it, then finally pressed send. Her heart thumped as if she had just jumped into icy water. Across the ocean, Mark saw the notification late at night, while sitting at his desk after Sarah had gone to bed. His breath caught when he read her name. He reread the message 3 times, feeling a rush of warmth and relief. She hadn't disappeared into memory. She was real, still reaching across the gap. He typed back, his fingers almost trembling. Emily! Of course I remember. How could I forget those days? I did make a home, though it felt strange to leave when you were still stuck there. I'm glad to hear from you. How are you? Emily received a reply the next morning before heading to school. She couldn't help but smile. They began to exchange messages slowly at first, short updates, small details about daily life. Emily spoke about her students and the challenges of teaching in winter when the classrooms were always cold. Mark spoke about work deadlines, rainy Seattle evenings, and the relief of being back with his family. Their conversations were careful, respectful, but beneath the words ran an undercurrent of something deeper. Each message seemed to acknowledge the shared experience they couldn't quite explain to others. By March, they had established a rhythm. Emily would wait to find a message from Mark, sent during his late evening. She would reply during her lunch break, and he would read it with his morning coffee. The distance of 8 time zones became a strange kind of companionship, a hidden thread weaving across the ocean. One evening, Mark asked, "Do you ever think about Denver? Not the storm itself, but us there." Emily stared at the words on her screen for a long time. She typed carefully, "Yes, I think about it often. It feels like we were in a world apart, outside of time, like it wasn't real, but it was. Mark replied simply, "Exactly, that's how it felt." As spring crept closer, Mark found himself scheduled to travel again, this time to Boston for a conference in April. He hesitated before mentioning it to Emily, but eventually he wrote, "I'll be in Boston next month. Strange to think of being back in an airport again. Part of me almost expects to see you there." Emily laughed when she read it, but then her heart tightened. She wrote back, "Well, Boston isn't so far from England compared to Denver. Sometimes flights from Birmingham go straight there." It was only half a joke, but the thought lingered in both of their minds. April arrived, and Mark flew to Boston. The trip was ordinary: meetings, presentations, dinners with colleagues. Yet every time he walked through the terminal, he thought of Emily. On his last evening there, sitting in his hotel room, he wrote to her, "I keep expecting to hear your voice in the concourse." Funny, isn't it? Emily, reading the message late at night in Birmingham, whispered to herself, "Not funny, just true." She began to wonder if chance could play its hand twice. Months passed, and no distance stretched between Mark in Seattle and Emily in Birmingham. The connection they had forged during those frozen days in Denver never faded. Their messages continued, evolving from casual check-ins to long conversations about dreams, struggles, and the little victories in everyday life. The storm that had trapped them together became a shared memory, a symbol of resilience and unexpected companionship. Eventually, the thought of meeting again shifted from wishful thinking to careful planning. In late summer, Mark booked a flight to England. When he arrived at Birmingham Airport, the hum of travelers and the scent of coffee felt familiar in a way that made his heart beat faster. Emily was waiting near the large windows overlooking the runway, her hair blowing softly in the late summer breeze. When she saw him, time seemed to fold in on itself. Days, weeks, and months condensed into a single moment. They walked toward each other, a quiet smile on Emily's face, and Mark's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and joy. Neither spoke at first, letting the emotions of reunion carry them. At that moment, the airport, once a place of waiting, frustration, and uncertainty, transformed into a place of new beginnings. The storm that had stranded them had passed, but what remained was stronger than any delay or hardship. A bond forged in adversity, now blossoming into a choice to be together despite distance, time, and circumstance. And as they stepped outside into the warm evening, the world felt wider, brighter, and filled with possibilities neither had dared to imagine during those long, snowbound nights. The story of a winter storm, of canceled flights and restless nights, had become the story of two people who found each other in the most unlikely of places and held on,